Hello and welcome to APS Stamp Chat. I'm Ken Martin, Director of Expertising for the American Philatelic Society. Joining me is Murray Abramson with Stamping the World Through the Mail. Stamp Chats are made possible through the support of APS members. To learn more about APS membership, please visit our website at stamps.org. For those of you watching live, your microphone and camera are disabled during the presentation. You can use the chat section to share with fellow attendees. Please submit any questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of these questions as reasonable following the presentation. If you have to leave or miss any of this presentation, the session is being recorded and will be posted on the APS YouTube page in the next few days. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Murray Abramson. Murray joined the American Philatelic Research Library Board of Trustees in 2022. He is a life member of the APS, having joined in 1986. He joined the Royal Philatelic Society of London in 2016 and was named a Fellow of the Royal in 2021. He has presented to collectors worldwide, including at the Postal History Symposium, the Collectors Club, and the Royal Philatelic Society of London, where he won the Lee Medal for Best Digital Presentation in 2021. Murray has served in the editorial board of the Collectors Club Philatelist. He currently chairs the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics. He earned a BS in chemistry from Duke University as a graduate of the Duke University School of Medicine. Throughout the 19th century, the post office reshaped how we communicate with each other, helping to shrink the world one letter at a time. The post also shaped changes in technology and trade around the world. Murray will take us through the postal factors that changed technology and trade up to World War II. Thank you for being with us, Murray. It's great to see you, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share my passion of this topic. Indeed, for me, I'm looking at the world through the eyes of not only as a philatelist, but a postal historian, trying to make sense of the things that we today take for granted. You put a letter in the mailbox, some of us still do that, and we don't even think about the process. By and large, it seems seamless. But it wasn't so long ago in which, I would say in the early 1920s, where the idea of sending a letter around the world beyond the ship mail was really cutting-edge technology. The ability to send a letter, as many of the people know, the audience knows, the postal history of ship mail is vast and extraordinarily important. It was organized in a more cohesive way through the UPU in 1875. But there was 45 years after the formation of the UPU where there was obviously no mail that could travel by air. And it really wasn't until first man in the air in 1903 where that was even a possibility. And it took years after that where it started to take on a certain appeal. But it wasn't really until the 1920s where we start to see this. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the mail, how it came to be organized following the recognition by the Universal Postal Union, the UPU, and what it meant. And I'll show, as a philatelist and a postal historian, I'll show you some of the examples, some exciting, and to me, exciting examples. So I would hope that today there are a few things I'd like to make sure people appreciate and get out of the talk. We'll talk a little bit about the UPU recognition and the framework that allowed for airmail to take place. This formation allowed for messages to travel outside of the United States and from my perspective, to destinations that would have taken months to otherwise receive word. This happened through Europe, through a European hub, and there were other foreign services available to the US sender of mail in the 1920s and 30s. And then as it approached World War II, we see that a lot of the mail that could no longer travel because of the limitations of the war, both in Europe, but in Asia eventually as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the consequences of these services and really stop at a point right as World War II was beginning where there was a lot of different type of activities going on, but it stopped. Pretty much a lot of the services stopped until the end of the war. And I won't cover that. This is not part of the scope of this conversation. This will be perhaps a topic for another time for those who wish to read more about it, think more about it. So let's talk a little bit about the recognition by the UPU in the framework. As I said, it really wasn't until 1920, the UPU Congress in Madrid, did the UPU even recognize air transport sector. Following the ratification of Article 4B, a country such as the United States could then enter an agreement with another postal administration for air service. Up until that point, each country had its own air service, maybe. The US surely did. It wasn't widely used, as many of you know. For domestic mail, that wasn't until later in the 1920s. But it at least served as the framework that additional air services could be provided between two or more countries, but these were extraordinary services. The first agreement, and keep in mind, there were lots of agreements and treaties that existed prior to this time, but it really dealt with both ground relations as well as ship relations. And this was the first relationship. It happened to be with the United Kingdom, Great Britain. It was the earliest US Post Office Department agreement. And this treaty, so-called treaty, was between postal ministers. And for air service, it allowed the British Post Office, it offered from the British Post Office to the United States that there was a willingness to carry US letters paid with US stamps to receive air service from Cairo to Baghdad. And this was offered in the early part of 1922. And indeed, the postal rate at that point, it was published in February 13th, 1922, and it was for 15 cents per ounce. And it was at the point where the letter, and I'll share with you that letter. Actually, I'll share the letter. This is the earliest known US flown letter via any foreign air service using the first US-British airmail agreement. This is the only known registered cover using the 1922 Cairo-Baghdad air service, and it's correctly paid with US stamps. It's a bit old looking, but it's incredible in its own right that it still exists. This letter was sent June 2nd, 1922. It paid the 5 cents rate, which was surface from New York to England to Egypt. But from Egypt, it did travel air service part of the way from Egypt to Iraq using this British offered service for 15 cents, and it paid 10 cents as well for a registry fee. So it's a pretty incredible letter. You can see some of the back stamps here. Given the early nature of this, there was really not very many standards that went into it. It did have a New York stamp. It did have a registered stamp from London, and of course, the Baghdad backmark. What made this possible was this very letter that I'm showing you. It comes from the British Postal Archives, and it was the British Post Office that offered the US Post Office Department air service. It's dated May 15th, 1925, and actually, yes, 1925. And it reminds the post office of the letter and cablegram describing a plan for new airmail service that would start on the 9th of May. So from 1922 to 1925, the only way that the US could receive this service was Cairo, Baghdad, and it was an agreement between the US Postal Service and the British Post Office. This letter was a new idea the British Post Office had. They had increasing amount of mail traveling to various places within Europe by and large, and they were offering the United States an opportunity that they could not only participate with the Cairo-Baghdad, which had already existed, but they could also now receive airmail service from the UK to parts within Europe. That service would start in May in 1925, at least so the offer included. This agreement really allowed the Post Office Department to enter a letter of intent to carry mail to the European continent and Northern Africa. And the idea here is that the New York Post Office would be designated as an exchange post office, where they would prepare all the mail the US has sent and then subsequently dispatch the mail by ship to the UK. And from the UK, it would then go on to its destination, either in part by air or entirely by air. The New York Post Office offered the service and prepared a separate open mail sack for London. It was similar to what they had done with Cairo, Baghdad, and the airmail was sent separately from registered and ground mail. Now, it so happened that the post office accepted this offer. You can see this letter dated June 26, 1925. It came from the second assistant postmaster, and it was sent to the secretary of the British Post Office. And the US Post Office accepted the offer of the British Post Office and informed them, just as I said, that the New York Post Office would be the exchange where airmail would be prepared and then sent to the UK. This is the actual letter that's in the archives at the British Postal Museum. And it was really exciting because as I did research in this space, I had thought that such a document would exist. It wasn't in the United States. It was long discarded from archives here in the US, but this copy did exist in London. And the very circle I have here is with reference to the foregoing, I have to inform you that the department agrees to make use of the above-mentioned airmail service as occasion offers. And with that sentence came what we know today as international airmail from the United States using foreign service. The way that this became publicly known is that the New York Post Office Daily mentioned, published on June 29th, 1925, where the US Post Office informs postal workers of the new airmail destinations, postal rates, and the procedures of how the letters are to be handled. And along with this gives you time of departures and the various places that you could send the letter. And as you can see, and we'll cover in a couple slides, the destinations were increasingly, again, within Europe, Western Europe, as well as North Africa. This notice was in the archives as well. And this was really the instructions to the post office within the post office to say how the mail was to be handled. Keep in mind at this point in time, if a letter was sent from the US to the UK, how was it going to be prepared? How was it going to be paid for? All of these things that had been previously worked out for ship mail decades before had not been prepared within the United States. So there was a lot of clarifying about sorting, labeling, accounting procedures. In addition, it also announced that the first sack of mail was dispatched on the SS Aquitania, June 30th, 1925. So it's a very informative letter that starts to put into organization how letters would be transmitted by air or for air service somewhere within the UK network. And it's particularly important because up until this point, sending a letter really consisted of ship and ground. And now we have an additional mode of transportation added to that that's available to the US customer. The early accounting sheet, I won't go into this, but you can see it's fairly basic. Depending on the country, there were a number of them in the lower right-hand corner. It would designate the rate, and you would keep track of the ounces of the letters and the rates. And there's a very laborious process. So they weren't necessarily preparing for a highly efficient, very technical process up in the very early days. The opportunity was fairly limited. I mean, from Southampton, where the ships would come in, from London, the airmail would take off. The limitation of the British Post Office to Paris, Basel, Switzerland, Brussels, Cologne, Amsterdam, Hanover, and Berlin, Germany. Now, what's interesting is from these places, Cologne and Berlin particularly, the post office in Germany could offer airmail services even further. And so in the early days, we're talking about the mid-1920s, suddenly you can accelerate a letter by days, potentially, by the use of this service. Now, I'll cover a very interesting point. We had the agreement with the UK. We did not have an agreement with Germany. So how did that work? And we'll talk a little bit about that. This is actually the only known letter that I'm aware of my 30 plus years of collecting this. This letter is a commercial letter flown using the British Air Service to a European destination. So we covered the first known agreement that went to Baghdad. This particular letter went service the European destination, and it was actually on the inaugural SS Aquitania Air Service connection. We know this because of the date of the letter, June 30th. So keep in mind, the announcement went out June 29th. This letter was departed on June 30th, possibly the 1st of July, and arrived in Southampton a week later. It only paid the 5 cents surface mail, and it paid that new rate, that 6 cents to Germany rate, that would allow the British Post Office to send it to Germany. In this case, it traveled through Cologne, eventually going to Munich. You can see the instructions in the upper left-hand corner: airmail, London to the continent. That's all it needed. The back stamp was Cologne, and it's July 8th. So you can see that it received service in the evening of the 7th, and within a day, it was in Cologne, Germany. Now, what I alluded to earlier is that airmail in Germany was very important. The British Post Office had agreements with Germany and would allow the letters to travel beyond Germany. But the German Post Office was actually unaware of this. They were not aware that the British-American agreement even existed. And it was a couple months after the inauguration of the service that the German minister asked for official word from the British Post Office. What are they doing? Are they sending mail transmitted through Germany using the German service without their knowledge? And the answer was actually yes. So keep in mind that this was acceptable at the time because the British had the agreement with Germany that allowed for those letters prepaid to go through the German system, even though the German government, the German Post Office, was not aware. Keep in mind also that there were no rules to international airmail at this point. So all the rules that controlled the ship mail had not been established yet for airmail. And so when we're looking at these commercial envelopes, these commercial use of airmail for businesses and personal notes, suddenly people, everyday people as well as businesses, were able to accelerate the mail, and that brought the world closer together than it ever had been before. Now, if an agreement didn't exist, some postal administrations demanded that postage be paid at dispatch to receive airmail service. So in the example we saw already, the British agreement, we paid US postage stamps. The British Post Office accepted that because we had a way to pay them. We tracked it through the system you saw, and then the British Post Office would get their money. In the case of an administration that didn't have an agreement with the US, you actually had to pay for the service as if you were in mixed franking. It would be in US stamps, paid for the US part, and then depending on where the letter was coming from or going, it would be paid for in that currency. This is a good example of that. This is a very early example. This was an expedited letter from Western Canada. Since Canada didn't have a transcontinental air route at the time, they took advantage of the US airmail service. So postmarked or originating on November 22nd, 1926, this letter started off in Vancouver, went to Seattle. It paid for the Canadian postage, but from there it had US stamps to pay for the domestic air service that it received in the United States. And then if you notice, it then went to England. It didn't travel by air to England, of course. There was no transatlantic airmail at this point. It traveled by ship. But that had already been paid because it paid for the US postage. This is a very early, maybe one of the earliest known examples of such an idea, going from the west coast of Canada to the east coast of the United States and then to Europe. Now, this letter went the other way. This was expedited mail to central Canada from Tanzania, and it used, again, the US Postal Service to come and accelerate the mail to its final destination. This is a letter that started off in Tanzania and went to London by surface. It then used the US airmail service, 10 cents at the time. You can see here it's not postmarked. And then it traveled from Detroit to Canada, although it paid for registry fee as well. That was in Tanzanian stamps, all to accelerate the letter by a day or two. These letters, what I didn't say a little bit about my collecting interest and research interest is that I've been researching this area since the late 80s and early 90s. And so not only have I been able to do the research of postal rates that we now find in the Tony Vevakovich book, but indeed it was, I published some of this information in the philatelic literature before, but importantly, accumulating and identifying letters over these few decades has been a real passion of mine. And so it's very exciting to show, a little bit about my collection as I share the postal history and the connections of how the world became really closer together that drove economic progress and international communications in a time, of course, when this wasn't always possible. Now, the framework, by 1927, in a mere few years, it was increasingly obvious that a lot of countries were sharing and creating airmail services. And so there was a special conference called at The Hague in the Netherlands. And this opportunity in September 1927 created a framework for international airmail with a system of universal regulations. And the idea here was that they wanted letters to have a freedom of transit, that letters should be able to travel through any UPU member country. They wanted to establish standard ways of calculating airmail fees. And they also wanted to create regulations of how and when airmail payments were paid between countries. So what we saw in the early 20s between the US and the UK was really the beginning of this. By 1927, and finally ratified in London at the UPU Congress in 1929, they were able to establish a lot of the mechanisms that we actually take for granted and some of which are still functional today. This allowed for the US to now have operational relationships with countries outside of the UK. Suddenly, you could send a letter within the United States using US postage to places within Europe, places within Australia, Asia, and New Zealand, and routes within Africa too. The relationship that we had was similarly established like the English one. You could do this through France. Services were coming from France. Services were coming from the Netherlands. There were other opportunities, some service from Italy. These were countries within Europe that had an empire at the time. And so they were motivated and had air services that were developing at a very rapid rate to unify their empires. The US, of course, didn't have such an empire. So we took advantage of the postal rates, the routes that existed from England, the Netherlands, France, Italy, and a few others. I don't want to go too much into the technical detail given the nature of this talk, but the postal rates that a lot of my conversation will be about has to be broken into a few parts. The first part is if you were somewhere in the United States, you had to pay the postage typically to the New York post office to get to New York to make that transatlantic trip. You could send it by ground, you could send it by air, one or the other, but you had to pay for it. The second is that the New York post office, you would have to pay for the surface mail to the point of the European entry into the system, in the hub. That was typically a 5-cent rate, and that was the ship mail rate at the time. And then from the point in Europe where it was at that hub, you'd have to pay for the postage, typically a combination of air and surface, as was required by the agreement. And then you'd pay for any special fees and services, registration, that sort of thing. Keep in mind that the postal rate within the United States was changing a little bit airmail-wise, but wasn't rapidly changing. The New York to European hub entry, that was the UPU rate, that was stable this whole time. but the rates that existed within the airmail hub to the rest of the world was rapidly changing. It changed a lot. It was very complicated. Typically, there was a volume published annually and then multiple updates on a monthly basis by the US Postal Service to update postal workers of this. And indeed, it was rapidly changing. The routes were expanding, the rates were changing. This is, for me, a very interesting topic, but for a lot of people, it can be very complicated. So for the purposes of this talk, what I'd like to do is simplify it, slow down a bit, and share with you a few examples of each of these different hub routes. I think this is an interesting one to start off with because, number one, it's a letter to Germany from New York. So just as I shared with you, you had to go from New York, in this case, to England. You had to pay the postal rate. For a postcard, it was 3 cents. You had to pay the airmail rate from England to Germany, and that is 4 cents. What makes this particularly special is it's the only use of the UPU supplementary fee paid that I'm aware of on an airmail postcard, meaning that at the point in time that you wanted to catch the ship in New York to get to Europe, this postcard was being sent at a pretty late time, just before the ship was actually departing. And we know this because they would publish the ship rates, the ship times of departure in the newspaper. And there was a way in New York to send letters at the last minute, but in order to do that, you had to pay a supplementary fee, and it typically was the doubling. The 3-cent postcard rate in this case was doubled to 6 cents, and of course, this is what you see, a 10-cent stamp, paying 3 plus 3 plus 4. We know based on the marking that it also received a marking, so it received the shipside service was the French line Pier 88 in Manhattan, West 48th Street. So in some ways, this is both a very interesting airmail letter, because it's an early postcard sent airmail from the United States through London to Germany, but it's also interested in many other ways. This is interested from an airmail perspective because this letter was sent in 1929, well into the agreement that the United States had with Great Britain. It went from California to New York, which it paid for airmail service, 5 cents. It paid for the surface mail from New York to England, typically would have been 5 cents. Because it had airmail service, it was reduced by the US Post Office to 4 cents. And then it received airmail service from England to the USSR at the expensive rate of 14 cents per ounce. So this was, in order for somebody to afford this is now it's way more costly than a 2 cents domestic letter and a 5 cents domestic airmail letter. But businesses and people who wanted to accelerate their delivery of mail did it. We see that it received a Berlin backstamp, a Moscow backstamp, and in Russian it says that this received airmail service. So we know that it received airmail service, as well as the German mark that indicated that it went through Berlin. This is an example of the route within Europe that went through France. We've seen only British hub mail. This is the first French envelope that you've seen tonight. We know this for a few reasons. Number one, the backstamps that you'll see. This was sent December 23rd, 1930. It was sent to the bank in Scotland. So, but very interestingly, the UK, you wouldn't typically send a letter via the UK to get to Scotland by air. This letter went not from the UK, but from Paris, where it received the French service, because there was an airmail route that provided service through them. It paid for the surface mail rate of 8 cents, New York to France. It was a 2-ounce letter. It paid for airmail service from France to Scotland, 4 cents per ounce, 8 cents, and it paid for registry fees, 15 cents. It's 1 cent overpaid. But it received both the New York backstamp, the Paris backstamp, and you can see the final destination, the Scottish backstamp. But mail went well beyond the continent of Europe. as the British Imperial Airways were extending to Africa and Asia, eventually to Australia, the US now was able to expand their mail service through this service into these more distant countries. This included letters to Asia from England. This is the only known letter to Saudi Arabia of this era. It traveled not directly to Saudi Arabia because there was no airmail route to Saudi Arabia at the time. It traveled from London to Alexandria, Egypt, and then by surface through the Suez Canal, eventually back into Egypt, across the Red Sea to Jeddah. This happened February 27th, 1936, and it paid for all the appropriate rates, the airmail rate, the surface mail rate, and then the airmail rate from England to Egypt. Keep in mind that this was a 1 ounce letter, so it was 6 ounce per half ounce, so it paid even more. And the surface mail from Egypt to Saudi Arabia didn't have to pay extra for that because it already paid for the UPU rate that was the surface mail from New York to Egypt to England. So it's a very unusual letter for a very unusual time for the United States. It was once again expanding the scope of how Americans could write to people across the globe and have their mail received in relatively short time. What's incredible, it has some back stamps as well, and it can show you that it only took a matter of 2 weeks or so to eventually arrive in Saudi Arabia. I think that's pretty incredible for 1936. Now, we've covered most of the time it traveled transatlantic by ship. In this example, this is a commercial envelope that actually traveled transatlantically by, in this particular case, airship, the Graf Zeppelin, and the final destination was Persia. There are many components of this cover that are really fascinating. First off, you can see that the person who sent the letter spent $1.42. That was by no means a small amount of money. The person who sent it is also very interesting in their own right and quite famous in the United States. The people who sent the letter, the couple, were married in 1929, just a year within that past year. And apparently they made frequent buying trips to Persia in the 1930s, and they acquired a treasure trove of European and Chinese antiques. Now, eventually they became well-known and recognized leaders in luxury ceramic antiques and reproductions and historical designs. If you speak to people in the United States in the museums and their designs in the White House where they had their china, it is also well known. So this is actually a legitimate business commercial use sent from, for business purposes, sent to a relative of theirs within Persia. And it paid the Zeppelin fee at the time because there were occasional airship services that were made available. We typically think of them in philatelic circles as these special opportunities, but there is commercial mail as well. And it paid $1.30 for that service. From Germany, it traveled to Egypt and then to Persia using the air service at 12 cents per half ounce. So now you can understand why there's $1.32 paid for this service. Very neatly indicated on the left in red as well. This is a bit later. This is an example of another cover following England through to Asia, to Hong Kong in this case. The postal rate in 1938 was 34 cents per half ounce, paying 68 cents plus the 5 cent. It only took 17 days for a letter to travel from New York to Hong Kong at this point in time, which is really a remarkable point of technology. A lot of what you see are communications to people traveling or businesses that would have taken many more days, if not weeks or potentially months, to be able to have a letter. Given the time, I'm going to go through a few more covers here, a little bit faster. But there was a Dutch service that would go to Asia. I'm not going to go through this cover, but similarly, it went to Timor at a very interesting time, paying the correct postal rate. This was a use of a Hindenburg transatlantic service, but it went through Europe to go eventually to China, through and then on to Japan. And it paid the correct postal rate here. The back markings associated with it. And then there was French services to Asia as well. And this is a large envelope going to Lebanon, paying for proper service. The difference on this letter is that it was transmitted or mailed August 5th, 1939. And by 1939, the middle of 1939, you could now send a letter airmail from New York to Europe. And so, unlike earlier mail that you've seen that typically traveled by ship, maybe by German airship, in this particular case, it actually traveled by clipper. And this letter went to French Indochina. This is a special envelope, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this one. In part because it's the only known U.S. letter that traveled to Asia via airmail to the USSR and then mailed to Japan. So as you could imagine, it was way easier for mail to travel to Japan Trans-Pacific. But there was a point in time where even though there was Trans-Pacific airmail offered by the U.S. Postal Service, it was much more expensive. It was 70 or 75 cents, depending on the time. In this particular time, it so happened that there must have been a stamp collector who had correspondence with H.E. Harris, the well-known stamp company at the time from Boston, and they correctly and commercially paid for this airmail service. It went from Boston to New York, first class. It paid for surface mail 5 cents, and then it paid airmail from France to Moscow via Berlin to Eastern USSR. And I'll show you a map of how it did that. It paid 27 cents per half ounce. So correctly paid, it actually is quite a remarkable envelope in many respects because it paid for all these services. It traveled from Moscow. So keep in mind, it traveled from Western Europe through Berlin, from Berlin to Moscow. And then it used a Soviet airmail service from Moscow all the way down to Vladivostok, eventually going to Japan. And the back markings show that. There's a back marking from Paris, one from Berlin, and again, are received with airmail in Russian. Imperial Airways also had mail coming to Africa. And this is another really special cover, so I'll spend a bit of time on this one. There was no regular airmail service until January 20th of 1932. So why is this letter dated November 28th, 1931, how did it get to South Africa? Well, actually, it was really quite fortuitous. The sender would not have been aware of a special rate that was extended air service to Cape Town. It was announced on November 30th, 2 days after the letter was sent. It so happened for the holiday season that there was beginning service, commercial service, via London to South Africa through Africa. The letter actually traveled to South Africa by air for free. Ordinarily, this letter would have traveled by air as far as possible, probably Sudan, given the postal rate that did exist by that time, and it was able to accelerate all the way to Johannesburg. This letter traveled, dated from November 28th. The backmark it received was 23 days later. Keep in mind, in 1931, sending a letter from New York to South Africa in a matter of 3 weeks is really incredible. Again, another testament to the global expansion of the new postal service. This is a fascinating cover, but given time, I'm going to skip this one. But there was also airmail service through France, which is very important. This is a really nice cover. In part, it also is a Graf Zeppelin cover that's commercial use. It's from one business, David Subon, to his relative who worked in sewing machines and other sorts of things, systems. It's a business correspondence. It paid for the first-class airmail, New York to Lakewood, and then from the Lakewood to Germany, Graf Zeppelin for $1.30, hence the stamp. And then it paid for the airmail service from Germany to France to Tunisia for 6 cents. Somehow it was able to go from New York to Tunisia in a matter of 8 days, which is an incredible technological feat and allowed for this business correspondence to take place. 4 days to Germany, 6 days to France, 8 days to Tunisia. You could see how fast the mail traveled in that period of time. This is a letter that traveled to Liberia via France. Again, a very short-lived rate. I won't go through it, but the transit time, important for this talk, 15 days. You are now able to speak not only for business purposes, but a lot of mail from the United States coming to people who were missionaries in various parts of the world, in this case, Liberia. A very special letter, also a UPU surcharge rate, a very technical letter. I think for the purposes of this talk, I'll skip over it, but I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A if people are curious. And then lastly, there was airmail service through Italy. A lot of people aren't aware of it. The Italians did fly to North Africa, what they considered their North African colonies prior to World War II. This is really the only known correctly paid envelope that traveled from the United States via Rome to Africa. It's a remarkable letter for lots of reasons. It traveled from Pennsylvania in 1937, October. It paid for the airmail service to New York, 6 cents. It paid for the UPU surcharge rate from New York to Italy, 2 cents. And then from Italy, it went on to Ethiopia for only 21 cents. A lot of money, actually, back in that time, correctly paid from, Butler, Pennsylvania. It's remarkable. It's a beautiful cover. It's the only one that I'm aware of correctly paying for this rate. And the backstand, Addis Ababa, the transit time was a mere 14 days. There were other services that are available. We're not going to go through all of them. You could have sent a letter via Colombia to Colombia or Ecuador at various times. There were private Canadian companies at times in the 1920s that you could send. There was service that was available within Belgian Congo, service within South Africa. You could send letters within Japan, within China, and Australia as well. All of these could be done using US postage for the US sender. A SCADA letter, this is a very early one. I'll touch on it. In 1923, there was first mentioned use of airmail service between city in Colombia and to interior parts of Colombia. There were really no postal arrangements because this service, SCADA, was a private company. And so you had to pay both in US stamp as well as in SCADA stamps. Another SCADA example, but this time from the Canal Zone. This is a private service that was offered in Canada from British Columbian Airways. This is fascinating for many reasons, including the fact that this actually was never flown because there was an airplane crash just days before. So the person who sent the letter to Canada, who wanted the letter to be accelerated, wasn't aware that the service wasn't available, even though they paid for it. And this letter received airmail service within Belgian Congo only. They paid the 5 cents to get to Belgian Congo. They needed to get interior to the country to receive service to a reverend and his wife who were missionaries. They paid the extra 6 cents to accelerate it so that it could go airmail into the jungle to reach them much faster. And this letter was going to Papua, but it went through Australia. So again, you have a letter that received surface mail, not this time from the Atlantic, but from the Pacific. Once it got into Sydney, Australia, it received Australian airmail service to Port Moresby, Papua. And this is a letter using Japanese service. It went from Illinois all the way to San Francisco, from San Francisco to Japan, and then from Japan to Manchuria, which was under occupation at the time, and it received the Japanese air service that got it to Manchuria. And then lastly, to finish up the talk, there was, of course, the topic that we didn't cover, and that was the U.S. foreign airmail routes. There are plenty of them. That in itself is a talk unto itself. There was service through Canada to Canada. There was service to Latin America, South America. There was crossing the Pacific, and indeed eventually crossing the Atlantic by air. And then the South Pacific. We're not going to cover that for this talk. It definitely changed the economics. It made Americans more accessible to the rest of the world through airmail routes beyond just the European ones that we talked about. We're not going to talk about the detail, except that by the time World War II started to approach, a lot of the European services were no longer available, and the only services may have been available were the US routes, Transpacific, but it came to an end, of course, on December 7th, 1941. That's a fascinating topic unto itself, but the purpose of this last cover or so is to show that you could still send a letter to Asia or to Africa from Trans-Pacific routes, such as this one going to Swaziland in 1940. Actually, this one, well, let's go through this cover and you'll see why I hesitate for a second. This was mailed 3 days before Italy entered World War II. The postal bulletin, the US Postal Bulletin, said that there would be a suspension of airmail service from Europe. And so this is a cover that actually intended to go through Europe. It went airmail across transatlantic. It intended the airmail to go from Europe to South Africa, but it went by boat. So as you can see, there was a loss of service because of the war. Because of this, there were new opportunities to go Trans-Pacific, and some of the service allowed service to go beyond during the war or right before the war through Asia into Africa, called the Horseshoe Route. And this is one of the last, actually, I'll show you this as the last cover before I stop for questions. This is an example, another letter to Swaziland that didn't travel through Europe. It actually traveled via the Trans-Pacific route. It correctly paid Massachusetts to Hong Kong or Singapore, the FAM 14 rate at 70 cents. And from Hong Kong or Singapore, it then went to South Africa and it paid that 40-cent rate. And within South Africa, it traveled to Swaziland. So what's fascinating by this is even up until right before the war, the expansion of the routes were happening. The total transit time to send a letter from the United States, Massachusetts, in this case, Peabody, Massachusetts, to Swaziland took 31 days. If you go back to the previous cover that I showed, it took way longer for that letter to travel to Swaziland because of the war, and it had to travel by boat. There are plenty other covers to discuss. Happy to do so during the Q&A. But I also wanted to leave everybody with a reading list. There's a number of great books and articles on this topic. Talks about the airmail, the expansion, the rates, the routes, the history of air cargo and airmail. All of these kind of talk about various aspects of the growing concept of airmail in the 1920s and 30s that we take for granted today. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for their patience and listening, and join up with Ken again to see if there are any questions from some of the listeners. Happy to address anything that people may have.
Thank you very much, Murray, for that great presentation. I don't see any questions yet, but let's give people a chance. Please use the Q&A. If you don't having trouble with Q&A, use the chat. If you have any questions, we have a few minutes, and I know that Murray would be glad to try to answer them.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful. I'm looking at the participants. It's a global audience. And indeed, with that said, if anybody has airmail from the United States to wherever in the world in the 1920s and 30s, happy to discuss, take questions, and share whatever I know to all of you.
Very nice presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm an anonymous attending. Ah, there we got another one.
Yes, the postcard with the supplemental fee. Could you point out where it gives the peer number? Excellent question. So if you look at this postmark, the New York one, it has a characteristic shape for supplementary mail at the time from New York. You can look at that design. It looks different than some of the other postmarks you may have seen on the other covers. There's the bars, the dark black bars at the bottom, and between, if you can barely see in this copy, it says the number 3. So this, which is called a black type G supplementary mail marking, has a peer code of number 3. And actually, there's a book that's written on supplementary mail. I'm going to look at it on my bookshelf right here. I would give the author a plug if I could find the book. U.S. Supplementary Mail, written by Piskowitz. He wrote a book a few years ago on supplementary mail, and in the book, as a good reference, it has the code and it decodes those peer code numbers to where it was applied ship site. In this case, the number 3 on that supplementary marking indicated a French line, Pier 88, but I only know that by virtue of reading his book and applying this cover to the reference material in his book. You could find other supplementary letters, and similarly, there will be a number at the bottom, and depending on that number, it'll be a different peer at a different time.
Thanks, Fred, for that question. We have another question from Mike Hoppert. For the earlier covers that had mixed frankings from Canada and the US, how did the sender get the stamps from 2 different countries?
Excellent question. As was the case, there were US stamps available at various locations in Canada. So people actually had access to buy US stamps for this exact purpose. Usually in Vancouver or for westward mail. So it was such a thing. You would also see, interestingly, the cover that went to Canada the other way. It went from Africa using accelerated US airmail into Canada. Where did they get that stamp? Similarly, there were people who actually had US stamps, whether definitives or airmail stamps, and they're pretty hard to find, but you can find them, and there were people who had service of airmail stamps available to them globally.
How many routes were available to Dutch East Indies from USA?
There were a number of routes to the Dutch East Indies. The most prominent one was through the Netherlands route. It went throughout the Dutch East Indies colony at the time. So you could receive airmail service via Amsterdam, or there was also British service that went through the Dutch East Indies colony. It was really aiming to go to Australia, but of course, at the time you needed to fly into Dutch East Indies for stops, and so you could have sent the letters paying the British Post Office for their service as well. That service was actually available quite early in the late 1920s or early 1930s through the Netherlands, and much later from the Dutch government, or from the British government.
There's another thank you in the chat.
Well, it's wonderful to have you as the host, Ken.
Thank you.
And if there are additional questions that come up, please feel free to forward them to me. My email address being murray.abramson@gmail.com.
We will do that. So again, let me thank Murray for the excellent presentation. If you joined late or missed any part, you can visit the APS YouTube page in a few days to watch the presentation. Feel free to share the presentation with your friends. Remember to like and subscribe to the APS YouTube page for future stamp chats and other video content. And if you're not an APS member or a member of the APRL, we'd certainly welcome you. Please join our stamp community. For more information, you can certainly visit our website, stamps.org. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening. And especially again, thank you, Murray. Great job.
Thank you, Ken. It's a real pleasure. Have a great evening.
You too.